"Oh my God, it's still alive!" Dr. Sarah Bennett yanked her hands back from the small, shivering body nestled inside the rusted trash can. The stench of rotting food and damp cardboard filled the cold evening air behind the veterinary clinic, but she barely noticed. Her heart pounded as she reached forward again, hands trembling to lift the fragile creature wrapped in a torn dish towel. A puppy, no older than a few weeks, gasped for breath in her grasp. Its ribs poked through patches of dirt-matted fur, and tiny paws dangled limply. But it was the eyes that stopped her cold. Wide and glassy, the puppy's gaze locked onto hers with an unnatural intensity. Sarah had treated hundreds of sick and abandoned animals over the years, but something about this one made her chest tighten. A deep, gut-wrenching sadness swirled within those innocent blue eyes, as if they had already seen more pain than any creature should. "Hey, Dr. Bennett, you okay?" Sarah turned sharply at the sound of her assistant's voice. Mark Riley, a lanky college student with a mop of blonde hair, stood in the doorway holding a clipboard, his breath visible in the chilly air. His usually carefree expression shifted to concern when he saw the puppy in her arms. "Somebody dumped it," Sarah said, her voice thick. "Right in the trash." Mark set his clipboard down and hurried over. "What kind of person does that?" Sarah shook her head. She didn't want to think about it. The clinic had taken in plenty of strays, but something about this felt different. She cradled the tiny body closer to her chest. "Let's get it inside. Fast." They rushed into the brightly lit examination room, where Sarah gently placed the puppy on the table. Mark grabbed a clean towel and began dabbing away the grime while she checked its vitals. The pup's breathing was shallow, but steady, and its heartbeat, though weak, was still fighting. "This little one's a fighter," she murmured, glancing at Mark. He nodded. "Think it'll make it?" Sarah met his eyes. "We're going to do everything we can." She cleaned the puppy's fur, careful not to hurt its fragile skin. Underneath the filth, its coat was a mix of golden brown and white. Its ears flopped slightly, too big for its tiny head. It was adorable, despite its dire condition. Mark leaned closer. "What's wrong with its eyes?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. There's something different about them." The puppy blinked up at her, the deep blue pools reflecting something she couldn't place. Intelligence? Fear? Hope? It was as if the tiny creature understood its fate rested in her hands. She swallowed hard and reached for a warm bottle of formula. "Come on, little one," she whispered. "You've got a second chance." The puppy's tiny mouth latched onto the bottle, and Sarah felt a rush of relief as it started to drink. She knew the night was just beginning, and there was no guarantee the pup would pull through. But in that moment, with its frail body clinging to life and those haunting eyes locked on hers, she made a silent promise. She wasn't going to let this little one down. For the next hour, Sarah and Mark worked together to stabilize the pup. They wrapped it in a soft blanket, placed it in a heated incubator, and monitored its every breath. The clinic had seen its share of abandoned animals, but this felt personal. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this puppy had been thrown away for a reason. By the time the clock struck midnight, exhaustion weighed heavy on Sarah's shoulders. She stood by the incubator, watching the puppy's chest rise and fall in the steady rhythm of sleep. Its eyes fluttered slightly, as if caught in a dream. Mark stifled a yawn. "I can stay if you want to get some sleep." Sarah shook her head. "I'll be fine." Mark hesitated before nodding. "All right, call me if you need anything." He left the room, leaving Sarah alone with the tiny life they had just saved. She pulled up a stool and sat beside the incubator, unable to tear her gaze away from the sleeping puppy. Tomorrow, she'd start looking for answers. Who had abandoned it? Why did its eyes hold so much sorrow? And most importantly, what kind of future could she give it now? She reached through the small opening in the incubator and gently stroked the soft fur. The puppy stirred slightly, pressing its head into her hand. A small, hopeful smile tugged at her lips. "Welcome to your new life, little one." The battle wasn't over, but for the first time since she found it in that trash can, Sarah believed this puppy had a chance, and she was going to make sure it got the happy ending it deserved. The next morning, Sarah walked into the clinic feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. But as soon as she saw the incubator, she felt a renewed sense of determination. The tiny puppy was still there, alive, curled up in the soft blanket she had placed around it. Its breathing was steadier now, less labored, and its tiny body rose and fell in a peaceful rhythm. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Mark walked in a few minutes later, clutching a cup of coffee and rubbing his eyes. "You stayed all night?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, I wanted to make sure." He stepped closer, glancing into the incubator. "Looks better." Sarah nodded. "I think so." The morning routine at the clinic began as usual, checking on boarded animals, scheduling appointments, handling walk-ins. But every spare second, Sarah found herself by the incubator, watching the fragile little pup as if willing it to keep going. By midday, the puppy was stirring more, even lifting its head slightly, though it was still far too weak to move much. Sarah prepared another bottle of formula and gently cradled the puppy in her arms as she fed it. It drank slowly, its tiny tongue lapping at the milk. Sarah's heart squeezed at the thought of how close this little one had come to death. Someone had thrown it away, left it to die. But now, it had a second chance. As she fed the pup, she studied its face more closely. There was something about its eyes, too intelligent, too aware for something so young. And something else, too. A sadness that didn't seem right for a creature that should have been full of curiosity and trust. A knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Dr. Bennett?" Mark stuck his head in. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." Sarah frowned. "Who is it?" "Some guy. Said his name is Tom Riley." The name didn't ring a bell, but she gently placed the puppy back into the incubator and stepped out into the reception area. A man in his late 50s stood by the front desk, looking around the clinic with an anxious expression. His short-cropped gray hair and the deep lines on his face gave him a weathered look, but it was his eyes, sharp and searching, that caught her attention. "Dr. Bennett?" he asked as she approached. She nodded. "That's me. How can I help you?" Tom hesitated for a moment, then pulled out his phone and tapped the screen before holding it up. "Is this the puppy you found?" Sarah's stomach dropped. On the screen was a grainy photo of a tiny golden brown and white puppy curled up in a cardboard box. It looked exactly like the one she had rescued. She swallowed. "Where did you get this picture?" Tom exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "It was sent to me, along with a message." He hesitated before continuing. "I think someone is trying to send me a warning." Sarah blinked. "A warning?" Tom glanced around as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. "That puppy. It's not just some stray. Someone left it there for a reason, and they wanted me to know about it." Sarah's mind reeled. She had assumed it had been abandoned, left behind by someone who didn't care. But if what Tom was saying was true, then this was something else entirely. Who would do that? And why? Tom shook his head. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Sarah crossed her arms, her protective instincts kicking in. Well, whatever the reason, this puppy is safe now. Tom looked at her, his expression unreadable. I hope so, because if someone wanted it dead, they might not stop just because you saved it. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She glanced toward the door leading to the exam rooms, where the puppy lay in its incubator. For the first time since finding it, a sense of unease settled in her gut. Who had left that puppy in the trash? And what were they trying to hide? Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest after Tom's visit. She had dealt with plenty of cases involving abandoned animals, but this was different. This wasn't just neglect. Someone had deliberately left the puppy in a place where it was unlikely to survive. And now, there was an implication that it was more than just an accident. That someone might actually want it dead. The thought made her grip the edge of the counter in the clinic's back room a little tighter. She turned to look at the incubator, where the puppy was sleeping soundly, its small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. It looked peaceful now, but the question lingered. Why was this little one a target? Mark returned from his lunch break, pushing the door open with his shoulder. Hey, I grabbed an extra sandwich if you... What's wrong? Sarah didn't respond right away. She exhaled through her nose and shook her head. That man, Tom Riley. He showed me a picture of the puppy. It was taken before I found it. And he said someone sent it to him as a warning. Mark frowned, setting the sandwich bag down on the counter. A warning? Why? That's the part I don't understand. Sarah rubbed her arms, suddenly feeling the chill of the clinic's air conditioning more acutely. He said he doesn't know either, but he intends to find out. Mark glanced at the incubator, his expression darkening. So someone threw the pup away on purpose? Not just because they didn't want it, but because they wanted it gone? Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the words even as she said them. It looks that way. Mark shook his head in disbelief. That's messed up. I mean, what could a tiny puppy have done to make someone go that far? That was the million-dollar question. Sarah had spent years treating abandoned and abused animals, but she had never encountered a situation quite like this. I don't know, she admitted. But until we figure it out, I don't think it's safe to assume this was just a case of neglect. Mark hesitated. Do you think someone might try to come after it? I mean, if they went through the trouble of making sure it was left to die, what if they realize it's still alive? The possibility sent another wave of unease through Sarah. She hadn't considered that angle yet, but Mark had a point. If someone had a reason to get rid of this puppy, they might not just let it go. We need to be careful, she said finally. For now, we'll keep the puppy here. I don't want to risk taking it home just yet. Too many unknowns. Mark nodded. And if someone comes looking for it? Sarah squared her shoulders. Then we make sure they don't get near it. For the rest of the afternoon, she tried to push the troubling thoughts aside and focus on her work. The clinic was busy, with back-to-back appointments keeping her occupied. But in the quiet moments between patients, her mind kept drifting back to the puppy in the incubator. That night, after the last patient had been seen and the clinic was locked up, Sarah stayed behind. Mark had offered to stay too, but she told him to go home and get some rest. She couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to be here, watching over the pup. She sat in the break room, sipping a cup of coffee, when she heard a noise outside. A soft shuffling, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. Her heart jumped. She set the cup down carefully and stood, straining her ears. Nothing. She walked to the back door and checked the lock. It was secure. Peeking through the small window, she scanned the alleyway behind the clinic. The streetlights cast long shadows, making it difficult to see anything clearly, but she didn't spot anything unusual. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. She turned away from the door and made her way back toward the incubator. The puppy stirred slightly as she approached, letting out a tiny whimper. She reached in and gently stroked its head. "You're safe," she murmured. "I promise." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure how true they were. The mystery surrounding this tiny creature was growing deeper, and Sarah had the unsettling sense that they were only just beginning to uncover the truth. And she had no idea what they would find when they did. Sarah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the faint noise she had heard outside replayed in her mind, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of unease. She found herself checking the locks multiple times, staring out the window for any sign of movement. The puppy, unaware of the tension surrounding its tiny existence, continued to rest in the incubator, its breaths steady and peaceful. By morning, she forced herself to shake off the paranoia. There was work to be done, and she needed to focus. She checked the puppy's vitals first thing, relieved to find that it had gained some strength overnight. Its eyes were more alert now, those strangely intelligent blue eyes watching her as she prepared another bottle of formula. "You're a mystery, little one," she murmured as she fed the pup. "And I don't like mysteries." Mark arrived soon after, his usual easygoing demeanor slightly dampened by concern. "You look exhausted. Did you stay all night again?" Sarah sighed. "Yeah, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right." Mark frowned. "Did something happen?" "I don't know. I thought I heard something outside, but when I checked, there was nothing there." Mark glanced toward the back door. "You think someone's watching the clinic?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. But if Tom was right, and this puppy was left as some kind of message or warning, I don't think we can ignore the possibility that someone might come looking for it." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Should we call the police?" Sarah shook her head. "And tell them what? That I found a puppy in a trash can and now I feel like something isn't right? We don't have any proof of anything." Mark exhaled sharply. "So what do we do?" Sarah looked down at the puppy, now curled up against the warmth of the blanket inside the incubator. "We keep it safe, and we try to figure out who left it there." Throughout the day, Sarah found herself glancing out the windows more often than usual. She went through the clinic's appointments distractedly, unable to shake the feeling that something was building, something just beyond her reach. Then, in the early afternoon, the clinic phone rang. Sarah picked it up, forcing herself to sound normal. "Westfield Veterinary Clinic, Dr. Bennett speaking." There was a pause, then a deep voice that sent a chill through her. "Stay out of things that don't concern you." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" Another pause. Then the line went dead. She stood there, the dial tone humming in her ear, her pulse thundering. She slowly lowered the phone, trying to steady her breathing. Someone knew. Someone knew she had the puppy, and they didn't want her involved. Mark walked in just as she was setting the phone down. "Sarah? You okay?" She turned to face him, her face pale. "Someone just called. They told me to stay out of things that don't concern me." Mark's eyes widened. "Okay, that's creepy. Now can we call the police?" Sarah clenched her jaw. "Not yet. We still don't have enough. But this means we're on the right track. Someone doesn't want us looking into this." Mark rubbed his forehead. So what now? Sarah took a deep breath. Now we find out who's behind this. The rest of the day passed in a tense haze. Sarah and Mark worked their usual shifts, but there was a charged energy hanging over the clinic, a constant awareness that something was off. Sarah kept checking on the puppy, and every time she found herself whispering reassurances that she wasn't sure were true. That evening, after locking up, Sarah lingered in the back room, debating her next move. The call had made it clear. Someone was watching. Someone didn't want her to dig deeper. But that only made her more determined to get to the bottom of it. As she sat down at her desk, scrolling through local missing pet reports, an idea struck her. What if the puppy wasn't just abandoned? What if it had been taken from someone? Stolen, and then discarded when it became too much of a problem? It was a long shot, but it was a lead. She started making calls to nearby shelters, asking if anyone had reported a lost puppy matching the description. Each answer was the same. No missing puppies of that breed or age had been reported. Just as she was about to give up for the night, her phone buzzed. It was Tom Riley. "I found something," he said without preamble. "Meet me in half an hour." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Where?" He gave her an address, somewhere on the outskirts of town. "And come alone," he added. Then the line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone. Every rational part of her said this was a bad idea. Meeting someone alone, at night when she had no idea what they had found? It was dangerous. But if there was a chance this could give her answers, she had to take it. She glanced at the incubator one last time, then grabbed her coat and keys. "I'll be back," she whispered to the tiny pup. Then she stepped out into the night, heading toward whatever truth waited for her. The cold air bit at Sarah's skin as she drove through the dimly lit streets on the outskirts of town. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her mind racing with possibilities. Tom Riley had told her to come alone, and while she knew that was never a good idea, she had little choice. If this meeting could bring her closer to understanding who had abandoned the puppy and why, she had to take the risk. The address Tom had given her led to a quiet, unmarked building at the end of a deserted road. It didn't look like much. An old warehouse, maybe, or a storage facility long past its prime. She parked a few yards away and shut off the engine, taking a moment to steady her nerves. Her heart pounded as she scanned the area. No sign of Tom yet. She stepped out of the car, pulling her coat tightly around her, and walked cautiously toward the entrance. A single street lamp cast a pale glow on the pavement, its flickering light making the shadows dance ominously. She reached the door and hesitated before knocking. The sound echoed through the quiet night. Seconds later, the door creaked open, and Tom's face appeared. "You made it," he said, stepping aside to let her in. She walked in slowly, her senses on high alert. The inside was just as bleak as the exterior. Dusty, mostly empty save for a few scattered boxes and an old desk pushed up against one wall. Tom locked the door behind her. "What is this place?" she asked, turning to face him. "Somewhere we won't be interrupted," Tom replied. He motioned for her to sit on a wooden chair near the desk. "I found something you need to see." Sarah hesitated before sitting, keeping her hands in her lap, ready to push up at any sign of trouble. Tom walked over to the desk, grabbed a folder, and handed it to her. She opened it, scanning the contents quickly. The first thing that caught her eye was a printed email, an anonymous message sent to an unknown recipient. The subject line read, "It's done. No loose ends." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Where did you get this?" I have some contacts who help me track down things like this, Tom said. This was sent the same night you found the puppy. Sarah's eyes darted to him. You think it's connected? Tom nodded. I don't believe in coincidences. That puppy wasn't just abandoned. Someone wanted it gone, and they wanted to make sure no one asked questions. But they didn't count on you finding it. Sarah clenched her jaw. Why would anyone care this much about getting rid of a puppy? Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. That's what I'm still trying to figure out. But I did some digging, and there's more. The building near where you found the pup? It was recently rented by a company that doesn't officially exist. No records, no history, nothing. And the only lead I found was a name. David Langford. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the tension in Tom's voice made her uneasy. Who is he? Still working on that, Tom admitted. But he's tied to a few other cases I've looked into. Things that don't add up. Sarah exhaled slowly. So, what do we do now? Tom hesitated before answering. We need more information. And we need to be careful. If someone went to this much trouble to hide their tracks, they won't stop now. Sarah's mind raced. She thought about the call she had received earlier, the warning to stay out of it. And then there was the lingering fear that someone had been watching the clinic. We have to move the puppy, she said suddenly. If someone's looking for it, it's not safe at the clinic. Tom nodded. Do you have somewhere secure? Sarah thought for a moment before answering. There's an animal sanctuary just outside of town. A friend of mine runs it. They have space and no one would think to look there. Tom seemed to consider it. That might work, but you can't do this alone. I'll go with you. Sarah wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She needed help. Fine, but we have to be quick. Tom grabbed his coat, and they made their way outside. Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder as they walked to her car, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. But the street was quiet. Let's go, she said, starting the engine. As they drove toward the clinic, her thoughts were spinning. If someone had gone to this much trouble to eliminate a puppy, there had to be a reason. And whatever it was, she wasn't going to stop until she found out. By the time they reached the clinic, Sarah's nerves were on edge. She parked in the back lot and hurried inside, with Tom close behind. The puppy was still asleep in the incubator, completely unaware of the danger surrounding it. I'll get the travel crate, Sarah whispered. Keep an eye on the door. Tom nodded, watching as she carefully lifted the tiny pup and placed it inside a soft blanket before securing it in the crate. The pup barely stirred, too weak to react. Just as she was about to zip the crate closed, she heard something outside. A car door slammed. Her breath caught. She looked up at Tom, who had already moved toward the back door to peek out. We need to go. Now, he said firmly. Sarah grabbed the crate and held it close as they slipped out the back. The street was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As they reached her car, she glanced back at the clinic one last time. A shadow moved near the building. She didn't wait to see who it was. She jumped into the driver's seat, and Tom climbed in beside her. Drive, he said. Fast. Sarah's hands were steady on the wheel, but her pulse raced. She pulled onto the road, the tires crunching against the pavement as she accelerated. The sanctuary wasn't far, but every second felt like a lifetime. She didn't know who was after them. She didn't know why this puppy was so important, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let them win. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The shadow she had seen outside the clinic lingered in her mind. Was someone following them? "How much farther?" Tom asked, shifting slightly in his seat. He kept his eyes on the road behind them, clearly thinking the same thing Sarah was. "About 20 minutes," she replied. Her voice was steady, but her heart pounded. The puppy stirred inside the crate on the passenger seat, letting out a small whimper. Tom turned back toward the road. "Just keep driving. If someone's tailing us, we'll know soon enough." Sarah forced herself to focus, watching for headlights that lingered too long in the distance behind them. The rural road twisted through patches of forest, making it difficult to see much of anything. The sanctuary was tucked away on the outskirts of town, a place meant for animals to be safe. She hoped that would be true for them, too. The drive stretched longer than it should have, each passing mile weighed down by the possibility of danger. Finally, she saw the turnoff for the sanctuary. The dirt path leading to the property was unmarked, easily missed unless you knew where to look. She pulled in, slowing as the tires crunched against the gravel. The sanctuary's main building stood just ahead, its large barn-like structure illuminated by the single porch light. Rows of enclosed fields and kennels stretched behind it, hidden in the night. Sarah parked and turned to Tom. "Let's move fast." Tom nodded, already reaching for the crate. Sarah led the way up to the main building, knocking quickly. Within seconds, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 50s with cropped silver hair and a sharp gaze. "Sarah?" the woman asked, looking from her to Tom, then to the crate. "What's going on?" "Maggie, we need a safe place for this little one," Sarah said quickly. "Just for a while. Can you help?" Maggie stepped aside, ushering them in without hesitation. "Come in before someone sees you." They entered the warm interior of the sanctuary's office, the scent of hay and animals lingering in the air. Maggie gestured for them to place the crate on the wooden desk. "All right, tell me everything." Sarah and Tom exchanged a glance before Sarah launched into a quick summary, finding the puppy in the trash, the disturbing email Tom had uncovered, the phone call warning her to stay out of it, and the shadowy figure at the clinic. Maggie listened without interrupting, her expression darkening. When Sarah finished, Maggie exhaled slowly. "This is serious. If someone wants this puppy gone, they're not going to stop just because you moved it." Sarah crossed her arms. "We don't have a choice. I couldn't leave it there." "You did the right thing," Maggie assured her. "But we need to think a few steps ahead. If they come looking, they'll check the clinic first. If they don't find what they want, they'll expand their search." Tom rubbed the back of his neck. "So what do we do?" Maggie leaned on the desk. "For now, I'll keep the puppy here, away from the main enclosures. No one will know. But you two need to be careful. Whoever's behind this won't just give up." Sarah nodded. "We'll be careful, but we also need answers." Maggie studied her for a moment. "I might have a lead for you." Sarah's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Maggie hesitated before continuing. "David Langford. That name Tom found? I've heard it before. There was a case a few years back, an illegal breeding operation outside of town. Puppies were being smuggled, sold off market. A few people went to jail, but some names were never revealed. Langford was rumored to be one of them." Tom straightened. "So you think this is connected?" Maggie nodded. "It's possible. If that puppy was part of something illegal and someone tried to cover it up, you might be sitting on something bigger than just an abandoned stray." Sarah's stomach churned. "So this isn't just about one puppy. It's about something much worse." "Looks like it," Maggie said. "And if Langford is involved, you need to be very careful." Sarah exchanged a look with Tom. They had expected complications, but this was something else entirely. If they had stumbled onto something criminal, they weren't just dealing with someone trying to get rid of a puppy. They were dealing with people willing to make sure no one ever asked questions. Maggie straightened. "Leave the puppy with me. I'll make sure it's safe. You two, go home, get some rest. You'll need it." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She reached into the crate and stroked the tiny pup's head one last time. "You'll be okay," she murmured. Then, with the weight of something far larger than they had anticipated pressing down on them, she and Tom stepped back into the night, knowing this was only the beginning. Sarah's fingers drummed restlessly on the steering wheel as she drove back toward town. The weight of the conversation with Maggie pressed heavily on her. If what she said was true, they weren't just dealing with someone who didn't want a puppy. They were dealing with a network that could go far deeper than they ever expected. She cast a quick glance at Tom, who was staring out the passenger window, deep in thought. He hadn't spoken much since they left the sanctuary. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" she finally asked. Tom sighed. "That we might have just stepped into something way bigger than us?" "Yeah." Sarah tightened her grip on the wheel. If that puppy was part of an illegal breeding operation, that means someone is profiting from it. And if Langford's name is attached to it, that's not just some backyard breeder. We could be dealing with something organized. Tom nodded. And organized means dangerous. We need to be smart about this. If Maggie's right, and some of the key players got away when the last operation was busted, they might still be out there. And if they think we're a problem, he didn't finish his sentence, but Sarah understood. She exhaled slowly, trying to keep her mind from spiraling. We need proof, something solid that connects this puppy to Langford. Otherwise, we're just making guesses. Agreed, Tom said. But how do we get that proof? Sarah thought for a moment. If Langford's still involved in this kind of operation, he's not doing it alone. He needs resources, contacts, places to hide. There has to be a trail somewhere. Tom scratched his chin. Bank records? Property rentals? If he's laundering money through anything, there's got to be paper trails. Sarah gave a grim smile. And I know someone who might be able to find them. Tom arched an eyebrow. Who? An old friend, Sarah admitted. She used to work in fraud investigations before she started consulting. If anyone can find something on Langford, it's her. Tom sat up. Can you trust her? Sarah hesitated before nodding. I think so. We haven't talked in a while, but she's good at what she does. If there's anything on him, she'll find it. Tom exhaled. Then I guess we make a call. Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a small diner on the outskirts of town. She didn't want to make the call from her house or the clinic. Somewhere neutral felt safer. She grabbed her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and tapped a name. After 2 rings, a voice answered. Didn't expect to hear from you, Sarah. Sarah smiled slightly. Hey, Danny, I need a favor. A pause. This doesn't sound like a casual check-in. It's not. I need you to look up someone for me. David Langford. Anything you can find. Business dealings, properties, bank transactions, legal trouble. Another pause. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. You sure you want to go digging there? Sarah's pulse quickened. You know him? I've come across the name before, Danny admitted. But if you're asking me to look into him, I need to know what I'm dealing with. Sarah exchanged a look with Tom before answering. I can't give too many details right now, but I found something that might be connected to him. I need to know if he's still involved in anything illegal. Danny sighed. All right, give me a few hours. I'll see what I can find. Thanks, Danny. I owe you. Yeah, you do, Danny said, and the call ended. Sarah put her phone down and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tom leaned back in his seat. Now we wait. They ordered coffee and sat in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Every so often, Sarah's mind drifted back to the puppy, now safely hidden at the sanctuary. It was surreal how a single abandoned animal had led them to something so much bigger. Her phone buzzed about 2 hours later. She grabbed it immediately. Danny? Yeah, and you're not going to like what I found, Danny said. Langford's been off the radar for a while, but not completely. He's linked to a series of off-the-books breeding operations in the last few years. Nothing that sticks, though. Someone's been cleaning up after him. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? I mean, any paper trails that should exist don't. He doesn't officially own any of the places where these operations were busted, but his name comes up in whispers. And there's something else. I traced a few recent property purchases under shell companies. One of them? A warehouse not far from where you found that puppy. Sarah felt her blood run cold. So he's still active? Looks that way, Danny confirmed. And if you're poking around, you need to be careful. If someone's covering for him, they won't like you digging. Sarah swallowed. Understood. Thanks, Danny. Watch your back, Danny said before hanging up. Sarah put the phone down slowly. Tom leaned in. What did she say? Langford's still involved, and there's a warehouse nearby that might be connected to him. Tom exhaled sharply. So we have a location. Sarah nodded. We do. But now we need to figure out what we do with it. Tom leaned forward, his voice low. We check it out. See what we're dealing with. If there's something illegal happening there, we document it and take it to the authorities. Sarah hesitated. And if it's more dangerous than we think? Tom's jaw tightened. Then we get out fast. We're not heroes. We just need enough to expose whatever Langford's up to. Sarah thought of the puppy, of the people who had gone to great times, saw daylight again. She thought of Maggie's warning, of the shadow by the clinic. If they were going to take this next step, they had to be smart. Careful. But deep down, she knew they couldn't walk away now. All right, she said finally. Let's do it. Tom nodded. We go tomorrow night, under cover of darkness. Sarah exhaled and nodded. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were in deeper than ever. The next evening, Sarah stood outside the clinic, gripping her jacket tightly against the cool night air. The weight of what they were about to do settled over her, making her pulse quicken. She had spent the entire day thinking about Danny's warning and the risk they were taking, but she knew there was no turning back now. Tom pulled up a few minutes later, parking his truck a short distance away. He stepped out, his expression unreadable in the dim light. You ready for this? He asked. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. Yeah. Tom glanced around, checking the street before motioning her toward the passenger seat. Let's go before we change our minds. She climbed in, pulling the door shut as Tom started the engine. The drive was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The only sound was the steady hum of the tires against the pavement and the occasional flicker of headlights from passing cars. As they neared the warehouse Danny had traced to Langford, Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The building was just as unmarked and nondescript as she expected. The structure loomed in the distance, its exterior blending into the industrial sprawl of forgotten storage spaces and abandoned lots. Tom parked a safe distance away, cutting the engine. We walk from here. Sarah nodded and followed as he led the way toward the side of the building, keeping close to the shadows. She could see a few dim lights glowing through the windows, but otherwise, the place looked deserted. "What's the plan?" she whispered. Tom crouched near the corner of the building, scanning the area. "We get close enough to see what's inside. If it looks bad, we take pictures, get out, and figure out the next step." Sarah exhaled and nodded. "All right." They moved forward cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the gravel beneath them. As they reached the back of the building, Tom motioned for her to stop. He peered around the edge before looking back at her. "There's a door slightly open. Looks like someone's inside." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Can we see anything from here?" Tom shook his head. "Not yet. We need a better angle." He led her toward a nearby stack of wooden crates that provided some cover. From there, they had a clearer view of the entrance. Sarah's breath caught as she saw two figures inside. One was standing near a table, sorting through what looked like stacks of paperwork. The other was holding a clipboard, seemingly checking off a list. "That's him," Tom whispered. "Langford." Sarah squinted, her heart racing. The man near the table matched the few photos Danny had been able to dig up. He looked sharp, calculated, the kind of person who knew how to stay just outside the reach of the law. As they watched, a third man entered the room, carrying a small cage. Sarah stiffened as she saw movement inside it. A puppy. It was trembling, clearly terrified. Sarah gritted her teeth, every instinct in her screaming to do something. But she forced herself to stay put. They needed evidence first. Tom pulled out his phone, angling it carefully to take pictures. Sarah did the same, zooming in to capture as much detail as possible. Langford took the clipboard and flipped through it, nodding as the man holding the cage set it down near a stack of similar cages along the wall. There were more puppies, at least half a dozen, all confined in cramped spaces. Sarah's hands curled into fists. "This is worse than I thought," she whispered. Tom nodded grimly. "We've got what we need. Let's get out of here." They started backing away when a loud clang echoed through the night. Sarah's heart jumped as she turned to see Tom's foot had knocked over a small metal bucket. Inside the warehouse, Langford's head snapped up. He muttered something to the other men, and within seconds, one of them was heading toward the back entrance. "Go," Tom hissed, grabbing Sarah's arm. They turned and ran, moving as fast as they could while staying low. The sound of footsteps behind them sent adrenaline surging through Sarah's veins. They reached Tom's truck, and he fumbled with the keys before getting the door open. Sarah scrambled into the passenger seat just as Tom started the engine. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the road ahead. Just as they sped off, Sarah caught a glimpse of the man from the warehouse standing at the entrance, watching them. He raised a hand to his ear, talking into a phone. Sarah's stomach twisted. "They know we were there." Tom clenched his jaw. "Then we'd better move fast before they come looking for us." Sarah glanced at her phone, the photos of the caged puppies staring back at her. This was bigger than they thought, and they had just made themselves a target. But one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. Tom drove fast, taking side streets and back roads to avoid being followed. Sarah kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her pulse racing. "Do you think they're coming after us?" "I don't know," Tom admitted, gripping the wheel. "But we can't risk going home just yet. We need to be sure we're not leading them somewhere important." Sarah nodded, her mind whirling. "Maggie's sanctuary. Do you think it's safe?" Tom considered. "For now, but if they dig into who you are, they might figure out your connections. We need a backup plan." Sarah exhaled sharply, rubbing her forehead. "We need to get these photos to someone who can do something about this." Tom agreed. "Danny?" Sarah nodded. She might have contacts who can act fast. We need to get authorities involved before Langford realizes we have proof. Tom tightened his grip on the wheel. All right, let's lay low for a bit, then make the call. We're in deep now, but at least we have something to fight with. Sarah stared at her phone again. The image of the caged puppies burned into her mind. They were running out of time, and every second they hesitated put those innocent lives at even greater risk. Sarah and Tom sat in silence, the glow of the dashboard lights casting faint shadows across their faces. The weight of the situation bore down on them, each moment bringing a greater sense of urgency. The roads were empty, but it felt like unseen eyes were watching their every move. Tom finally spoke. We can't just sit on this. The longer we wait, the more danger we put ourselves in. Sarah nodded. Danny will know what to do. She's got connections. If anyone can get this in the right hands, it's her. Tom pulled into a dimly lit parking lot outside an all-night diner. Let's regroup inside. Make the call from there. It's safer than doing it on the road. They exited the truck quickly, both scanning their surroundings before heading inside. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few late-night customers and a waitress who barely looked up as they slid into a booth in the far corner. Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling to Danny's number. She hesitated for a second, then hit dial. Danny answered after the first ring. Tell me you're somewhere safe. For now, Sarah replied. But we don't have much time. We got into Langford's warehouse. We saw what he's doing. And we have photos. Danny exhaled sharply. Damn it, Sarah. That's not just some petty crime ring. You just stepped into something huge. I know, Sarah admitted. And they know we were there. They saw us leave. A pause. Then Danny's voice lowered. All right, listen carefully. You need to get off the grid for a bit. No returning home, no going to familiar places. If they're watching, they'll look at every part of your routine. Tom leaned in. What about the evidence? We need someone who can use it before Langford covers his tracks. Danny was silent for a moment. I have a contact at the state level. If you can get me the photos and details, I can get them where they need to go. But it has to be fast. Sarah glanced at Tom. How do we send them safely? Danny's voice turned urgent. Not digitally. Anything tied to your phone or email could be tracked. You need a physical handoff. We can meet, but it has to be in a secure location. Sarah's mind raced. Maggie's sanctuary? It's remote, and no one would suspect it. Too risky, Danny countered. Langford's people might already be monitoring you. We need somewhere neutral, somewhere they wouldn't expect. Tom rubbed his chin. There's an old train yard outside town. It's been abandoned for years. No cameras, no traffic. Danny considered. That could work. I'll be there in an hour. Be careful. The call ended, leaving a heavy silence between them. Sarah felt a cold sweat on her back. We need to move. Tom threw cash on the table for the coffee they hadn't touched and led the way back to the truck. They kept their heads down as they exited, scanning for anything suspicious. The drive to the train yard felt endless. The once bustling depot was now a rusting skeleton of its former self, covered in graffiti, weeds pushing through the cracks in the pavement. It was the perfect place for a quiet handoff. Tom parked behind an old shipping container, and they sat in tense silence, waiting. Every noise, every flicker of light from the distant highway made Sarah's pulse jump. Finally, another car pulled in, headlights off. Danny stepped out cautiously, her hood up, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. She moved quickly toward them. Do you have it? She asked, her voice low. Sarah handed her the phone with the images. Everything's here. Names, locations. It's enough to take them down. Danny nodded. I'll get this where it needs to go. You two, lay low. If they're serious about covering this up, they won't stop until they find you." Sarah's stomach twisted. What if we don't have time to lay low? What if they find us first? Danny met her gaze. Then you'd better be ready to fight. Tom took a deep breath. We need weapons. Something to protect ourselves. Danny frowned, but nodded. I have a contact who can help with that too. I'll reach out, but you need to disappear in the meantime. Do you have cash? Sarah nodded. Some. Enough to last a little while. Use it, Danny said. Ditch your phones. Don't use credit cards. Stay somewhere off the grid. I'll message through a secure channel once I have more. Tom exhaled. All right, we have a plan, but this is getting dangerous. It was always dangerous, Danny corrected. But now you're in their sights. Make sure you don't make it easy for them. Sarah and Tom exchanged a look. They had known this wouldn't be simple, but hearing it spelled out so plainly made the danger feel more immediate. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She had started this to save one puppy, and now they were caught in something far bigger. Danny left as quickly as she had arrived, and Tom wasted no time pulling out of the train yard, taking a winding, indirect route to ensure they weren't being followed. Where do we go now? Sarah asked, the exhaustion setting in. Tom thought for a moment before answering. I know a place. It's not much, but it's safe. We'll figure things out from there. Sarah nodded, resting her head against the seat. There were still so many unanswered questions, but for now, staying alive was the priority. Whatever came next, they had to be ready. Tom drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as the empty road stretched before them. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the low hum of the truck's engine. Sarah sat beside him, her body tense, her mind racing through every worst-case scenario. How far is this place? She finally asked, glancing at the dark surroundings. Not far, Tom replied. Just a little cabin I know, way off the main roads. We should be safe there for a while. Sarah exhaled, leaning her head back against the seat. You really think Langford's men will come after us? Tom was quiet for a moment before answering. I don't know, but I don't want to wait around to find out. The truck's headlights cut through the dense trees as they turned onto a narrow dirt road. After a few minutes, a small, weathered cabin came into view, partially hidden by thick foliage. Tom pulled up beside it and shut off the engine. We'll lay low here for now, he said, stepping out. Let's get inside. Sarah followed him up the creaky wooden steps, her eyes scanning the darkness for any movement. The door was stiff, but Tom managed to push it open, revealing a modest interior with worn furniture and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. It's not much, but it'll do, Tom said, dropping his bag onto the table. We can figure out our next move in the morning. Sarah nodded, exhaustion finally catching up to her. She sank onto the old couch and ran a hand through her hair. We need to be smart about this, Tom. Langford isn't going to just let this go. Tom sat across from her, his expression grim. I know, but we're not defenseless. Danny's getting the evidence to the right people. If we can stay ahead of them long enough, we might actually have a shot at bringing this whole thing down. Sarah sighed. I hope you're right. The night passed slowly. Tom took the first watch, sitting by the window with a shotgun in his lap while Sarah tried to get some rest. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside made her flinch, every rustling leaf sending a spike of paranoia through her veins. At some point, she must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, Tom was shaking her shoulder. Sarah, wake up! She jolted upright, her heart hammering. What? What is it? Tom gestured toward the window. We've got company. Sarah scrambled to her feet and peered outside. A set of headlights was approaching from the main road, moving slowly. "Do you think it's them?" she whispered. "Only one way to find out," Tom muttered, gripping the shotgun tighter. "Stay low." The vehicle came to a stop just outside the cabin. The engine idled for a moment, then shut off. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out, illuminated by the truck's headlights. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't one of Langford's men. It was Danny. Tom lowered the shotgun, but he didn't relax completely. "What the hell is she doing here?" Sarah threw open the door and rushed outside. "Danny! What are you doing here? You said to lay low." Danny's face was set in a hard expression. "I know, but I needed to warn you. Langford's people are looking for you, and they're close." Sarah's stomach dropped. "How close?" "Close enough that you need to leave. Now!" Tom stepped forward. "How did they find us? We were careful." Danny shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe someone tipped them off. Maybe they've been tracking you longer than we thought. All I know is that they're coming, and if you stay here, you won't make it out." Sarah's mind raced. "What do we do? We can't keep running forever?" "No," Danny agreed. "But we can make sure you're not easy to find. I have a safe house a few hours from here. No one knows about it. You go there, stay out of sight, and let me handle the rest." Tom frowned. "And what exactly are you going to do?" Danny's expression darkened. "I'm going to make sure Langford has bigger problems to deal with than finding you." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, we trust you." Tom sighed. "Fine, but if this goes south, we're not going down without a fight." Danny smirked. "Good, because this fight isn't over yet." Tom grabbed their bags while Sarah helped Danny cover their tracks. They doused the fireplace and wiped any sign of their presence before slipping into Danny's car. The night stretched before them, the road a dark ribbon leading them further into the unknown. Hours passed in tense silence as Danny drove. She navigated through back roads, avoiding main highways, ensuring no one could follow them easily. Sarah found herself staring out the window, her mind caught between exhaustion and fear. "How long until we get there?" she finally asked. "Not long," Danny replied, her hands firm on the wheel. "It's a hunting lodge an old friend of mine owns. It's empty most of the year. No one will think to look for you there." Sarah nodded, but couldn't shake the unease in her gut. "And what about you? What are you going to do?" Danny's lips pressed into a thin line. "I have a few people I can lean on. People who want to see Langford taken down just as much as we do. If I can cause some chaos on his end, it might buy us more time." Tom leaned forward. "Just be careful. If Langford knows you're helping us—" "I can handle myself," Danny interrupted, her voice firm. "You just focus on staying hidden." Sarah clenched her fists. "We're running, but for how long? When does this end?" Danny's gaze flicked to her in the rearview mirror. "It ends when we make sure Langford and his entire operation go down for good. And I promise you, that's exactly what we're going to do." Sarah had spent the better part of the night staring out the window of the small cabin Tom had found, watching the shadows shift under the pale moonlight. The air was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a night bird. She tried to keep her thoughts clear, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of those caged puppies, their small bodies trembling in fear. Tom had fallen asleep on the couch, his breathing steady and deep. Sarah envied his ability to shut everything out, if only for a little while. She glanced at her phone. No new messages from Danny yet. That should have been a good thing, she told herself. No news meant no complications, at least for the moment. but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before Langford's people caught up to them. They had seen her and Tom leave the warehouse. They knew someone was digging into their operation. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that what they had uncovered might only be the surface of something much larger. Just as she was beginning to doze off in the chair by the window, her phone buzzed. She grabbed it immediately, her heart racing. It was a message from Danny. "We've got movement. Langford's people are on the lookout. Don't go anywhere familiar. I'll have more soon." Sarah frowned. She reread the message twice before typing a quick reply. "Got it. What's the next step?" Danny's response came almost instantly. "Sit tight for now. I'm arranging a meeting with someone who can help. We'll let you know when and where." Sarah sighed and put the phone down. It wasn't much, but it was something. At least Danny was still in the loop, working behind the scenes. For now, they had to remain invisible, a task that felt increasingly difficult as each day passed. The morning came slowly, the sky shifting from inky black to pale gray. Tom stirred on the couch, stretching and yawning as he sat up. "Any updates?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Danny says Langford's people are looking for us," Sarah said, keeping her voice low. "She's working on setting up a meeting with someone who can help." Tom nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Figures. We've stirred up the hornet's nest." "What do we do in the meantime?" Sarah asked. "We can't just stay here forever." Tom thought for a moment. "We lay low. Keep an eye on the news, see if anything breaks. If Langford's operation is as big as it seems, something might slip through." Sarah wasn't sure if that was wishful thinking or a real possibility, but she nodded anyway. She needed to hold on to something, even if it was just the hope that they could find a way out of this mess. The hours dragged on. Sarah busied herself by tidying up the small cabin, checking the locks, and making mental notes of possible escape routes. Tom spent most of his time flipping through a stack of old newspapers he had found, looking for any hint of a connection to Langford's dealings. It was mid-afternoon when Sarah's phone buzzed again. She snatched it up, heart pounding. The message was from Danny. "Meeting tonight, 8 p.m. at the old service station off Route 19. Come alone." Sarah showed the message to Tom. He frowned. "Alone? That's a risk." "I don't think we have a choice," Sarah said. "If Danny trusts this contact, we need to hear what they have to say." Tom hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But I'm not staying here while you go off by yourself. I'll wait nearby, just in case." Sarah didn't argue. The idea of having backup, even at a distance, gave her a sliver of reassurance. "Fine," she said, "but stay out of sight. If anything feels off, get out of there." Tom agreed, and they spent the rest of the day preparing. As the time drew closer, Sarah felt her nerves tighten. She checked the small handgun Tom had handed her earlier, a precaution neither of them had wanted to take, but both knew was necessary. She slipped it into her jacket pocket, hoping she wouldn't need it. As they approached the service station, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the area bathed in darkness. The station was a relic of a bygone era, its faded sign barely legible, the cracked asphalt of the parking lot overgrown with weeds. Sarah parked at the edge of the lot, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. Tom pulled in behind her, turning off his lights and staying back as agreed. Sarah stepped out of the car, scanning the area. A single light flickered above the old service bay, casting long shadows that made everything seem more menacing. She took a deep breath and walked toward the building. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, mid-40s, with a rugged face and a military bearing. He wore a plain jacket and jeans, his hands tucked into his pockets as he approached. "You Sarah?" he asked, his voice low and even. "That's me," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded. Danny said you've got something important. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him the photos of the puppies, the cages, the documents they had managed to capture. He took the phone, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled through the images. "This is bad," he muttered. "Real bad." "Who are you?" Sarah asked. "How can you help us?" The man looked up, his expression serious. "My name's Grant. I used to work federal cases, organized crime, smuggling rings. I know the kind of people Langford deals with, and I know how to get this into the right hands." Sarah exhaled, relief washing over her. "So you can shut him down?" Grant hesitated. "It's not that simple. Langford's not just running a backyard operation. He's got protection. People in places that make it hard to touch him. But if we play this right, we can start pulling threads, unraveling the network." "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. "I need you to lay low," Grant said. "Let me handle the handoff. Once this gets into the system, we'll see where it leads, but you can't draw any more attention to yourself." Sarah nodded, though the thought of stepping back felt impossible. She had come this far. Could she really just walk away now? "How long will it take?" she asked. Grant shook his head. "Hard to say. But if I can get this into the right hands, Langford won't be able to hide forever." Sarah looked over her shoulder, where she knew Tom was waiting. "All right," she said finally. "Just promise me you'll do whatever it takes to stop him." Grant's gaze was steady. "You have my word." They exchanged a few more details before Grant slipped back into the shadows, leaving Sarah alone under the flickering light. She walked back to her car, her mind racing. The next step was out of her hands now. All she could do was trust that Danny and Grant knew what they were doing. Tom met her at her car, his expression tense. "How'd it go?" "He's going to take it from here," Sarah said. "He knows what to do." Tom nodded, though the worry didn't leave his face. "Let's get out of here." They drove away, the old service station fading into the night behind them. As they made their way back to the cabin, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had found the help they needed. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over yet. Sarah and Tom returned to the cabin, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The drive back had been silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. Now, the reality of what they had done, what they had uncovered, hung between them like an unspoken weight. Sarah stared out the small window, watching the tree branches sway in the wind. The distant glow of headlights on the highway reminded her of how fragile their safety was. Somewhere out there, Langford and his people were working to cover their tracks, to erase the evidence she and Tom had risked everything to gather. Tom poured 2 cups of coffee from the old pot on the stove and handed one to Sarah. "You think Grant's gonna pull it off?" he asked, his voice low. "I hope so," Sarah replied. "He seemed like he knew what he was doing. If anyone can get this in the right hands, it's him." Tom leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "We did what we could. We can't change what's already happened." "I know," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't stop thinking about those puppies, about everything we saw. How can people be so cruel?" Tom didn't have an answer. He just sipped his coffee, his brow furrowed in thought. The hours ticked by. Every sound outside made Sarah flinch. The creak of a tree branch, the rustle of leaves, each one felt like a prelude to something worse. She couldn't shake the sense that their involvement in this had set something in motion, something that couldn't be undone. Just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Sarah's phone buzzed. She snatched it up, her heart pounding. The message was from Danny. "Grant delivered the evidence. It's in the system. They're already making moves." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She handed the phone to Tom, who read the message and nodded. "Looks like we did it." But Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. Langford's network wouldn't disappear overnight. The people involved wouldn't just give up. They'd fight back, try to find new ways to hide their tracks. It would take time for the authorities to unravel everything, to ensure that no one could continue what Langford had started. "We need to be careful," Sarah said. "Even if they're making moves, Langford might still come after us." "So what do we do?" Tom asked. "We lay low," Sarah said. "We wait. And we hope that the evidence we gave them is enough." The days that followed were a blur of tension and waiting. Sarah and Tom avoided the news, avoided anything that might lead Langford's people to them. They kept their routine simple, staying in the cabin, watching the woods for any signs of trouble. But as the days turned into weeks, the sense of immediate danger began to fade. One evening, Sarah received another message from Danny. "Langford's been arrested. The operation's been shut down. It's over." Sarah stared at the screen, hardly daring to believe it. She showed the message to Tom, who let out a long breath and slumped into the nearest chair. "It's done." Sarah nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. The puppies they had seen in that warehouse would never leave her mind. But at least now, there was hope that no more would suffer the same fate. They had taken a risk, and it had paid off. "We made a difference," Sarah said softly. "Maybe it's not enough to erase what happened, but we stopped it from happening again." Tom looked at her, his expression serious. "You're right. We did what we could. And that's something." For the first time in what felt like months, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The battle was over. They had done their part. And while the memory of those dark nights and the horrors they had uncovered would stay with them, so would the knowledge that they had stood up for what was right. They had saved more than just a puppy. They had taken a stand, and in doing so, they had made the world a little bit brighter. The air outside was crisp, and as they stepped onto the porch, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of calm she hadn't experienced in weeks. The woods were quiet, the sky a deep blue turning to orange as the sun began to rise. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. "You okay?" Tom asked, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Getting there," Sarah replied. She leaned against the porch railing, her eyes scanning the horizon. "It's strange. After all that's happened, I keep waiting for something else to go wrong." Tom stood beside her, his shoulder almost brushing hers. "I know what you mean. It's hard to believe it's over." "It might not be completely over," Sarah said. "Langford's behind bars, but what about the people who worked with him? The ones who looked the other way?" Tom nodded. "There's still a lot to unravel, but the authorities will handle it now. We did our part." Sarah glanced at him, seeing the exhaustion etched on his face. They'd both been through so much, and it was clear the weight of their actions had taken its toll. But even so, there was a quiet resolve in his eyes, a determination that mirrored her own. "You know," Sarah began, her voice thoughtful, "this all started because of one puppy. Just one. And look where it led." Tom smiled faintly. "Kinda crazy, isn't it?" She nodded. "It's humbling, in a way. That tiny life we found in the trash. It set everything in motion." Tom leaned on the railing, looking out into the trees. "You think he'll be okay?" Sarah smiled, her expression softening. "I do. Maggie's taking care of him. He'll have a good life." They stood there in comfortable silence for a while, the early morning light casting long shadows across the ground. The chaos and danger that had consumed their lives seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. They hadn't set out to change the world, but they had made a difference. Tom finally spoke. "You ever think about what's next?" Sarah tilted her head, considering. "I guess we just take it one day at a time. Go back to normal, if there's even such a thing." Tom chuckled. "Normal sounds good. Boring, even." Sarah laughed lightly, the sound carrying through the crisp air. Boring would be nice for a change. They turned to head back inside, the warmth of the cabin calling them. But as they stepped through the door, Sarah paused, looking back one last time. The sunrise bathed the world in golden light, and for a moment she felt at peace. "We'll be okay," she said quietly, more to herself than to Tom. He glanced at her, his expression calm. "Yeah, we will." Together, they closed the door, leaving the past behind and stepping into a new beginning, one they had earned through courage, determination, and the simple belief that every life mattered. As the morning light filled the room, they knew they had done the right thing, and that was enough.